a time for the West. By the end of February 2275, the Interfector and Aileron had made the several weeks' journey back to Circle Junction, and it wasn't long after that time that the news of war between the Legion and Midwestern Brotherhood of Steel reached them. Preparations were already underway for this war as soon as they got news about the first failed talks with them back in late 2274. The Middle Eastern section of Colorado had largely been left alone by the Legion since they were home to the outskirts of the Brotherhood chapter around the Cheyenne Mountains. After the fall of Denver, the rest of Colorado was under Legion control, and the weeks of siege around the city allowed more time for Graham to regain his footing in the pacification of western Colorado. Caesar continued to lead the eastern front of Colorado against the Brotherhood, largely taking things into his own hands with the assistance of other legates and his secret right hand. As for the conquest of Dogtown, it should be noted that neither Carnifex or Lord Interfector obtained the credit for Dogtown's destruction in the immediate aftermath. The recognition simply went to Caesar, who was not even there for nearly the whole siege. Even though Lanius, or the Monster of the East, was later given formal credit, his role at the time still painted him as more of a legend than a person. As stated before, Carnifex was Caesar, when the city fell to the Monster of the East. Those who were there and saw the man butchering the people of the East Tower merely knew that they were looking at the extension of Caesar with the aid of Lord Interfector. Although Lord Interfector wouldn't get the formal recognition for Denver's destruction, and despite playing a significant role in the siege and assault, Caesar authorizing him to resume his praetorship in Circle Junction was the best reward he could have asked for. So, as Legate Graham was largely forgotten while Caesar shifted his focus against the Brotherhood, the Legion's Legatus Imperialis spent the early days of the new campaign still seeing to the tribes of eastern Utah and pacifying his territory in western Colorado. At the same time, the Interfector of Phoenix resumed his responsibilities of fueling the war in the east and handling the troubles around his territory of northern Arizona and New Mexico. Though the change in the Legion's identity was not immediate, the tactics and resources used in the entire Meat Grinder campaign were certainly enough to create a cascade of new issues that would be obscured by the new war with the Brotherhood. There will be more to say about the conflict against the BOS, but Montano once again was marched to the front of the new war under the leadership of Caesar himself and the Monster of the East. During this post-Dogtown era, Aileron continued to assist his Primus in Circle Junction while the BOS war ramped up. Circle Junction and the Four Corners region continuously had recent conquests from Colorado entering and exiting the camps, while new facilities were erected to support the new additions to the Legion's ranks. Denver Hounds. Caesar meticulously read the reports from Lord Interfector and Lanius throughout the siege, and despite the death of their chieftains, the hangdogs' males were welcomed into the ranks of the Legion. With the image of their monsters being burned in the fire, many hangdog warriors were spared the worst horrors of indoctrination camp in order to preserve their abilities with the Hounds of Denver that were quickly adopted into the Legion. Many former hangdogs were happy to allow their hounds to be used by the Legion in war, so long as their compliance with Caesar prevented more burnings of their dogs. Loyalty with this specific tribe came less from indoctrinated beliefs but rather the ability to use their hounds the way they'd been bred. With little change in the early days, Montano served as one of Carnifex's spearheads in the new BOS war, and the fight around Denver recently reignited the spirit of fire in Aileron's heart, allowing him to rediscover his love of frontline servitude. Upon return to Circle Junction after a long march and siege around Denver, the Interfector returned to his personal little palace in the interior fortress train warehouse, relieved Centurion Cassius as acting head, and rediscovered his family. You may remember that Lord Interfector's purchased wife named Amethyst gave birth while he was marching to Denver, even though he discovered his error in the child's naming sometime after arriving at Denver. He still found himself somewhat shocked to see firsthand that his child was a boy and not the girl he was hoping for. When he finally met the boy after returning to Circle Junction in early 2275, he still decided to keep the original name he instructed the child to have. It shouldn't be too big of a surprise that the murderer of Phoenix nearly avoided the child entirely for the early days. This was largely because neither he nor any other Legion commander enjoyed or had the ability to take care of an infant's needs. So, the majority of the child's upbringing was done by Amethyst, with the eager help of women like Gabriella and the other trusted slave women of the Circle Junction interior fortress. Lord Interfector spent most of his days conducting the usual business and addressing the problems of his territory as they arose, barely able to notice when the gradual changes took place. The reader may be wondering what specific changes took place in the post-Denver era. The answer to that again is something that was gradual. Caesar's war against the Midwestern Brotherhood of Steel was no less costly than the bulk of the meat grinder campaign. And the Legion itself was still on a course of struggle to uphold the manpower problems. Though the Legion was largely successful in the fringes of BOS territory in Colorado, numerous assaults on their regional headquarters of Cheyenne were repelled. The brotherhood that the Legion encountered in Colorado was unlike anything the few Legion officers familiar with the faction expected. Caesar, Lord Interfector, and a few others in the Legion's ranks knew about the brotherhood and expected a costly war against the faction notorious for being limited in numbers but incredibly dangerous. Although the brotherhood chapter was more numerous than expected and no less difficult than expected, it wasn't due to the expectations of traditional BOS engagement. The Midwest Brotherhood acted more like the other tribes of past Legion conquest. Their forces adopted tribal customs and their ranks were filled with tribals and settlers reaching as far as places like Old World, Illinois. Expecting to encounter small teams of power-armored soldiers with miniguns and Gatling lasers. Caesar was surprised to lead his forces against whole BOS regiments filled with lightly armored soldiers sporting conventional pre-war and tribal weapons, and occasionally even backed by super mutant allies and tame deathclaws if the rumors are to be believed. Even though the BOS was not shy of using the advanced technology of the Old World against the Legion, the unexpected and somewhat normal tactics of the Midwest BOS made them no less of a foe to be feared. As the war against the BOS went into mid-2275, the camps that were pouring out recent conquests of the Colorado campaign were running dry, and even more reserves were pulled from the occupied territories of Arizona and New Mexico. The manpower problems in the occupied territories were becoming a worsening problem that the Interfector had little means of dealing with so long as the war against the BOS continued. Caesar himself was not blind to this issue and read the reports from praetors like the Interfector, but Caesar continued to see how the problem played out rather than address it. By late 2275, the manpower problem across the occupied lands of Arizona, New Mexico, and even Colorado could be denied no more. Despite several large victories against the BOS in eastern Colorado, Caesar eventually landed another crippling blow against the Brotherhood in September of 2275 and demanded a ceasefire. The ceasefire was accepted by the BOS, especially after facing a foe unlike any other they'd experienced in years, and Caesar immediately retired to his former capital in Flagstaff. Nobody knew what was going on in the dictator's mind after his return to Flagstaff, and nobody knew what was next for the Legion. For the first time in almost 2 decades, the Legion was at peace, and the forces across all it had conquered were diminished terribly. With the bulk of the Legion's forces maintaining a presence on the eastern borders of Colorado, the forces occupying the lands of former campaigns were but a fraction of what they were before the start of the meat grinder. And the auxiliaries across Arizona and New Mexico were doing the majority of territorial policing. After Caesar entered his palace in the ruins of Flagstaff, there were no new orders from him, and so commanders like Lega Graham, Lord Interfector, and the other praetors could do nothing other than take advantage of the brief time to catch up. Lord Interfector used that time to rebuild Circle Junction's stockpiles of weapons that had been used in the campaigns, and take charge of the Auxilia while he addressed the continuing Ranger War in northwest Arizona. At night, when he wasn't conversing with Alaron about his duelist's recent battles against the Rangers, he spent those evenings wondering what exactly was causing Caesar's silence. All the while, Montano sat at his place around the campfires in the Colorado wilderness along the BOS border, waiting for the next fight. By October of 2275, Montano was granted respite and returned to his land in northern New Mexico after almost 3 years since his last visit, and reunited the slave sisters as he patiently waited for word from Caesar alongside the rest of the Legion. There were few who understood what the Legion was facing near the end of 2275, and those few were people like the Interfector who'd been worried about it since before the fall of Denver. Though they had no way of knowing it due to the silence from Caesar, the dictator was indeed thinking about the direction his legion was heading. The overwhelming issue at this moment in their history could only be called an identity crisis. By late 2275, the legion's style of governance and way it waged war was showing that it was not sustainable. They'd held regions and occupied vast lands in the past, but the wars across Colorado proved that the legion was better suited to be a roaming war force in this post-Denver era. Again, it can only be assumed that this is what was going through Caesar's mind, but the likelihood of this identity crisis was seen by the Interfector and looks something like a split. Does the legion want to continue its wars across the east? The past wars across Colorado pushed the legion further and further from their occupied and tamed lands in Arizona and New Mexico, with the conquest of Dogtown already being a stretch in what the legion was capable of logistically. At this point, after several more months of brutal war against the BOS, the legion was resembling more and more of a nomadic army as their territorial forces diminished in bloody battles across the east. Although the legion was still a terrible force to be reckoned with, pushing further east was simply not sustainable logistically. Continuing to do so would only lead to a complete pack-up of what was currently established in Arizona and New Mexico. Continued victory in the east was beginning to look more and more like a defeat in the west, leading many like the Interfector and likely Caesar himself to think, what was the point of all we'd done here if there would be nothing to show for it? The other side of this identity issue was, should the legion consolidate itself? This idea was rather multifaceted but fell completely in line with the Interfector's personal outlook on the legion. Unbeknownst to him, this idea was what Caesar himself was beginning to crave more and more. Caesar spent decades conquering, killing, and taming the violent quagmires of hostile tribals across Arizona, New Mexico, and then Colorado, building a terrible name and pacifying the lands through any brutal means. The course of this conquest gradually took them east as each conquered enemy only showed 3 more new enemies that needed to be tamed. These decades of success and triumph were turning the dictator bitter as by this point, he was no longer a man to his soldiers and subjects. He was a god. He was the ultimate unifier of rampant tribalism throughout the post-Holocaust world, and this god, who named himself after the great Julius Caesar, was no longer his own man. Edward Sallow was Caesar. The original Caesar conquered so much for Rome over so long, but Caesar needed to return to Rome in order for him to earn the true recognition he knew he deserved. The difference between the two Caesars was that the first one knew precisely what he was fighting for. Though the Caesar of the American Southwest originally believed he knew what he was fighting for as a unifier of tribes, eventually that goal became so vague that it needed some sort of true allegiance, especially with the crossroads he was facing after the Colorado and BOS wars. The Caesar of the wasteland had thousands upon thousands that loved and adored him even under brutal military occupation. But what he created eventually meant nothing in the eyes of its leader if he didn't have recognition from his homeland. Where Caesar of old conquered for Rome, the new Caesar was conquering without a cause anymore, and with the impending change in the fundamental structure of his creation, he would eventually come to the realization that his legion was destined to break free from its endless tribal wars. This monolithic horde of terror in the East, led by a man of the West, was always destined to return home. But what that looked like was still something being thought about in the silence of the Flagstaff Palati. All Caesar knew was that his legion was to be more than the occupiers of several former planes of tribalism, and far greater than a roving warband. Caesar needed to march his legion across its own Rubicon and seize its own Rome before his legion could become a true superpower in the post-nuclear wasteland. But where was that Rome? This Rome had to be a city, a region abundant with resources and spared, unlike the scrapped and irradiated carcass of cities already under legion control. Destiny and the future of Caesar's legion would play out due to several factors, but one of those factors is shown to us in the writings of Lord Interfector and the story of our 2 duelists. March 2276. No word from Caesar had been heard since September of 2275, and the Interfector was largely caught up on his issues to deal with before the march on Denver. Although one of these issues continued to be a burden, even that one was being handled generally well by Alaron, who was still experiencing that flame of desire for frontline servitude. Since Dogtown, Alaron had been handling the guerrilla war with the Desert Rangers in northwest Arizona personally. Over many months and several short excursions, he'd beaten back countless raids on Legion outposts near Grand Canyon and led the auxiliaries to numerous victories. If the Ranger problem continued to persist, the issue was at least handled in the era of Caesar's silence. Because Aileron proved to be an excellent handler of the Interfector's violent problems, it was just before spring of 2276 that he returned to the Interfector's side in triumph once again, even managing to bring a small train of captive Rangers back to Circle Junction. Although Rangers in the Minor War were caught on several occasions throughout the years of this minor conflict, almost all of the previous captives had escaped in one way or another before even reaching Flagstaff, let alone Circle Junction. Those Rangers who didn't escape usually had to be killed in their flight from Legion shackles. So Aileron's most recent return from another fruitful campaign brought back a very welcome gift to the Lord Interfector. The Interfector always enjoyed talking with Aileron about the most recent successes against the Rangers, and by this time, the Interfector's city was largely at peace as the slaves continued their work in the slave sectors, endlessly pumping out new weapons and equipment for use in coming campaigns. The morning after Aileron's recent return, Lord Interfector sat with the man in his domicile overlooking the fortress plaza. Sitting at the head of the wide, lavish desk, he and his second used for their usual report nights in busier times. Aileron looked past the elite out the window at the smokestack from one of the forges begin to release its smoke into the sky. Even though Aileron was hearing every word his Primus was saying, his eyes still glanced toward Gabriella sitting upright at her usual spot on the red couch beside the window with a pen and several blank sheets of paper at the ready. He knew his Primus enjoyed speaking to Aileron, and Aileron enjoyed listening to the man, especially when the opportunity to give input arose, but always one to assess his position. Aileron waited for the prompt to respond while taking note of his surroundings. As the elite went on about the recently ended BOS war, Aileron's eyes drifted to the other side of the room where Amethyst was teaching the infant addressed as Abel to walk beside the bed. Aileron considered smiling upon thinking about the child's impending mastery of mobility and how it would then lead to hand coordination, something that would then lead to blade mastery. Although Aileron did not smile, and the two other slave women were quiet in their admiration of the infant's progress. Looking back at the Interfector and glancing at the man beside himself, Aileron wondered if this was the time for such a meeting. However, that thought ended when Aileron heard the prompt for response given by Lord Interfector. Aileron replied, "I would say it could be quite some time before the Brotherhood regains the ability to fight, even if our forces are shifted to Utah. I would worry little about the East, even if such a front was established in the near future, my lord." The Interfector nodded in agreement and said, "I'm sure you're right, Aileron. You remember that batch of BOS captives, right?" Aileron nodded and the elite went on. "How on earth did most of them not know who Roger Maxson is?" Aileron had no idea who that was or what that name meant at the time, but he'd learned that Roger Maxson was the founder of the Brotherhood of Steel back in California, and agreed that it was odd how BOS soldiers operating in Colorado and the Midwest didn't know who their founder was. Aileron then thought how absurd it would be for any legionaries to not know the name Caesar. Not knowing Caesar would practically be treason for any in Caesar's ranks. Even the Auxilia knew the name, if not all the glory and honor that name entailed. Before Aileron could think any further, he answered the elite. Perhaps some of their ignorance could be due to items like that storybook that was brought before you. The elite scoffed and let out a sort of laugh. "Don't get me started on that thing, huh? Came from a military vault. Giant airships. The warrior destroyed the calculator and saved the world from a robot army. That was hilarious. I see that chapter out east moved on from technology recovery to story fabricating." "It would appear so, my Primus," said Aileron plainly. The Interfector was silent in thought for a moment before saying, "Strange times were in Aileron." He paused again before looking to the man at Aileron's side. "Speaking of strange times, I guess that brings us to this gentleman you brought before me." Aileron looked to the bound and gagged Ranger captive chained to the chair beside him, who was still looking around the lavish quarters, possibly searching for some means of escape while occasionally looking puzzledly at the infant and slave women softly cheering the boy's progress. After another silent moment, Aileron asked, "Shall we begin, Lord Interfector?" The elite nodded and stood from his chair. Gabriella on the couch sat up further and readied her pen once more as the elite turned to his child and slaves by the bed, Amethyst. Her head looked up from the boy, and the two other slaves beside her lowered theirs. "Take the boy out of here if you'd be so kind. You may use Aileron's private quarter till we're done." Amethyst replied appropriately and took the young Abel in her arms as the other women filed out of the domicile. When the door shut, a pair of veterans by the door locked it behind them, and Gabriella put the pen to paper as the elite sat back down and Aileron removed the gag from the bloodied ranger. The ranger spat on his lap and kept his focus there, remaining silent until the Interfector began. "It isn't often that I get to talk to desert rangers. You'd think after fighting you all for what, 7 years now, that I'd get to interview at least a few of you." The ranger remained silent still, but lightly tested the restraints once more as the elite went on. "Congratulations on being the first. Well, at least you and the other 5 my faithful Aileron managed to capture." The ranger struggled with his restraints once more, and Gabriella watched him, ready to record everything he said. The elite and Aileron remained quiet while the elite studied him expectantly, awaiting some kind of response. The only response that the ranger gave was another spit onto his own lap, seeming to still be recovering from being gagged for so long. The elite continued, "I gotta say that you all were rather annoying before the start of the Colorado campaign. But nowadays, you all are really starting to be a real pain. Why is that exactly? And why are you wearing an NCR flag on your uniform?" The ranger finally said, "Danielson, Ranger Senior, 2nd Ranger Battalion, Alpha Company." The elite and Aileron were again quiet for a long moment before the elite said dryly, "You know your name, and your unit, and your number." It was the first and only thing Aileron was able to report about you and your friends. "You didn't answer my question, though. I asked why you're bothering me, or Kaisar more importantly. But I'll be honest when I say that I'm personally more curious about why you and half of your pals are wearing NCR insignias." Ranger P. Danielson refused to answer, and more silence ensued. Finally, the silence was a bit too frustrating for the elite, and though he was not inclined to torture so early in an interview, he tried once more to better understand the captive from a relatable point. The elite said, "I'm only curious about your NCR markings, mostly. Are you and your Desert Ranger pals from there or something?" It is unknown what was going through the ranger's mind, but perhaps sitting before the elite and his rather calm demeanor was getting the better of his interest in cooperation. Immediately after capture, the rangers underwent numerous bouts of interrogation and torture on the road to Circle Junction. And nothing about caches or safe house in northern Arizona had been spilled by any of them. Only able to extract the name and unit from each man, Aileron found himself slightly surprised to finally see the ranger nod his head to answer the elite's question. Taking the nod for what it was, the elite said semi-enthusiastically, "No kidding? You're from California too? It may surprise you to know that I am as well." The ranger glanced up from his lap with a puzzled face as he looked at the armored man behind the desk. The elite then asked, "What made a strong California boy join the Desert Rangers?" Yet another long silence ensued as the ranger looked at the centurion in this faraway land who claimed to be from California as well. If the centurion from California was truly from there, surely he knew about the ranger unification. This strange politeness from the centurion supposedly from California as well made the ranger not believe the claim was true, but it was still enough to garner a response from the captive. The ranger averted his eyes and said skeptically, "We're the same." The elite's eyes grew wide and the ranger saw this, making the man believe his captor was indeed from California. But there was still something that the ranger couldn't figure as the elite asked, "What do you mean we're the same? Desert Rangers and NCR Rangers? When did that happen?" The ranger wasn't sure if his answers were simply satisfying a man's curiosity or leaking sensitive military information. Either way, the genuine nature of the elite's response prompted the ranger to ask his own question. "You didn't know this?" The Interfector shook his head slightly. "No, I did not." And then he remained silent for a long while. Meanwhile, the anticipation was eating the ranger as he still didn't know whether his answers or not were dangerous in some form. The more the Interfector seemed to mentally calculate, the more the ranger felt like his answer was just satisfying the man's curiosity. Finally, the elite gave another set of words that the ranger again couldn't make heads or tails of. "Huh? Coulda swore we'd been fighting the remains of Sheriff Clarkson's boys. Sheriff Clarkson? Thought the ranger. That man had only retired a few years ago. That man was the head of the Arizona branch of the Desert Rangers and was one of the prime instigators of the Ranger Unification Treaty with NCR. He and his group had been battling the Legion in Arizona since some place called Phoenix fell many years back. Either way, the ranger considered that even if this centurion was lying about his California affiliation, he was at least well familiar with the Desert Rangers. Suddenly feeling like he actually did release some classified information to an enemy commander, the ranger was about to say something else when he was again caught off guard by the Interfector's words. Anyway, why did you join the Rangers? Since the ranger was expecting that realization to prompt questions about the Rangers' presence in Arizona and the NCR army around Nevada. He wasn't expecting another strange personal question. Still, he felt safe with the personal nature of the question and felt that one from this supposed California centurion was innocent enough. Ranger Danielson answered with a new burst of defiance, ready to draw attention further away from lines of questions about NCR and Ranger positions. The ranger answered, "I joined the Rangers to fight slaving scum like you." Lord Interfector squinted and stayed quiet for a moment, seeing the diversion in full clarity. That makes sense, I suppose. Sheriff Clarkson's Desert Rangers scarcely ever showed up on reports before, say, I don't know, 2270 or about 71-ish. That sound about right, Alaron? I would say that is about correct, Lord Interfector. Since then, our ranger problem has only been getting worse. At least until recently, said Alaron with a tinge of pride in his role. The ranger was lost, but the Interfector turned back to him and asked, so, this Ranger unification took place in around 2271-ish, right? The ranger went completely silent, still trying to determine the importance of what he released. Finally, he concluded that the unification fact could be denied no more, and so he addressed this, but with the added effort of diverting the attention away from specific military concerns. Yeah, the Desert Rangers asked to be absorbed into the NCR Rangers in 71 to better kill the raiders and slavers around the Southwest, fucks like you. The Interfector telepathically ordered Alaron what to do. Alaron smacked the ranger across the jaw, and the man recovered, while the Interfector spoke his thoughts aloud for clarity. So that's why you joined the Rangers, I suppose. It's certainly in character for California to involve themselves in others' concerns where they have no interest. Upon recovering from the blow, the ranger heard those words and considered that perhaps this Legion officer was from California. This wasn't due to the elite's opinions about California, since those opinions were not shared by the ranger, but more due to the way he spoke about California. After this realization, the ranger still hoped to steer clear of more questions about his nation's army in Nevada, and did so by addressing the elite's opinion. The Rangers and NCR stand for the same. It's only an honor to act on NCR's behalf in this land. Your psychopaths, rapists, and murderers are spared from the might of the NCR, but we Rangers have no jurisdiction. We are proud to kill any of your Kaiser soldiers. Us Rangers in Arizona act on our own in these lands against all who stand against Republic values. The elite's face never changed from a stern contemplative state, and Alaron waited eagerly to be granted permission to conduct another blow after hearing the ranger's slew of words. Finally, after a full silent minute, Alaron noticed Gabriella still scribbling the ranger's words before the elite let loose an enormous laugh that he quickly caught before it went on too long. Ha ha ha. NCR standing for righteousness. All right, whatever you say. The ranger grew angry, but before he could respond and defend his nation despite fear of another blow, the elite asked another question. You're still skeptical about my California origin, aren't you? Whether or not the elite's prior words and stance on California were proof of affiliation or not was irrelevant. The question did in fact remain in the ranger's mind. The Interfector needed no response. He added a new question. Where you from, Ranger Danielson? What part of NCR? Capital, said the ranger softly. Shady Sands? No kidding? I figured as much. Those doubts about the elite's origin were rapidly vanishing from the ranger's mind. 99% of the people he'd met in Nevada before crossing over into Arizona had no idea what Shady Sands was. So hearing the name of his nation's capital from a man in the northeasternmost part of Arizona was especially shocking. The elite continued. I'm from the hub myself. Well, sort of. A bit northeast, actually. Lived on a ranch with my family during the NCR's expansion north back before you were born. It's a long story, but I learned exactly how righteous the NCR was when they burnt my home to the ground, killed my parents, my brother, and even my little baby sister. He paused and looked towards the door. Of course, it wasn't NCR, you'll say. No, they just hired mercs to do it. All for Councilman Weston of the Weston Ranching Company. The elite remained silent after going off, and Alaron looked to his Primus eyes slightly wider, having never truly heard that story from the man, even after all those years. Once the elite calmed down, he was no longer expecting an answer or any input from his captive, and was about to move on when the ranger stared him in the eyes with the words, "And now you burn others' homes to the ground and kill others." For several long seconds, an inferno shot from the eyes of the elite until more and more seconds passed and the flames subsided. After nearly another full minute of silence, the elite replied calmly, "At least I don't pretend to be something I'm not. I know what I am. I don't try to hide what I am behind laws or a false sense of righteousness like you and your nation." The ranger kept his lock on the elite's eyes, and the elite continued, "Next you'll try to justify yourself by notions of how I'm more evil than you are, and that's fine. You're entitled to that. You probably feel justified in killing my slaving and murdering soldiers, but I'll tell you something even you may not have thought of. All those men you kill are slaves too. They're slaves. They're servants of the Legion. They know of no other life or way to act, and you kill them indiscriminately because it's right. You're no more of an eradicator than I am. If you really wanted to be the righteous hero, the savior of slaves you claim you are, you'd understand that all of Kaisar's murderers and psychopaths, as you say, are just victims of the world we're in. Make no mistake, I am not proposing any alternatives to you. I'm just enlightening you to one simple difference between you and me. I understand that being free is not something that truly exists. You're only ever as free as your circumstance dictates. I don't know if you were born to a poor family or something, but even when you're born, you're not free to do anything. You're bound to your mother, your situation, this world at birth. From the moment you're born, you're bound to something, whether it's money, survival, family, responsibilities, etc. In the end, your anti-slavery crusade boils down to an argument of want, and wants are not something that is universal. The slave wants to be free. Therefore, you feel superior and want to kill me and my men. That's fine, so long as you understand that I want you fuckers to mind your own business. The only thing that's real in this world is power. I have it, you don't. I don't see what I do as a problem. You do. And what you believe is irrelevant when I'm in a position to enforce it. When the Interfector was done venting, the ranger was still internally considering ways to counter his interrogator's arguments. Suddenly, it occurred to him that he failed to find any purpose in this discussion. This meeting he was brought to was unlike any of the interrogations on the road to Circle Junction, and that speech did little to change his convictions about the nobility of his mission for the Rangers in Arizona. When enough time had passed, the ranger asked the exact question the Interfector was expecting. "Are you finally going to interrogate me about where our supply and weapons caches in Arizona are? I'd rather give you that information than hear any more shit about your sad upbringing or fucked up worldview. You and your servants are still human garbage." Before the ranger could speak anymore against the elite, Alaron was given the cue, and from there, Alaron proceeded to slam the ranger's head into the edge of the desk and mercilessly pummel the man. Just before the ranger crossed over the edge into unconsciousness, and after several teeth were thrown from his mouth, the man was propped back up, holding back sobs at the tremendous pain done to himself without warning. As Alaron sat the ranger back up, he pulled out his handkerchief and began cleaning the blood-spattered edge of the desk as his Primus said, "I am not interested in the ranger's supply and weapons caches. I heard all I needed to at the start of our talk. And your pathetic justification for bothering Lord Kaisa was explained in your hostility." The ranger felt the blood pouring out of his mouth, and a few of those tears broke free at the horrendous pain. Still, the ranger sat up firm, trying desperately to keep his composure while breathing in large breaths, occasionally choking on the blood as the elite continued. "You NCR Rangers have decided to involve yourselves in business that is not yours under the guise of righteousness in lands that you have no jurisdiction. The increase in aggression on your part since your little unification may have aided in giving you some sense of noble purpose, but the elite moved around the desk and knelt down right in front of the man still groaning in agony. Your little crusade to do what's right just sealed the deaths of a lot of people. And here you claim that I am the bad guy. Ha! Lord Interfector stood and looked back down at the man as the ranger spat up more blood from his crippled mouth. Those little caches and safe houses in northwest Arizona won't matter before too long. Although their existence this side of the Colorado leads me to believe there's something of a crossing point in the ranger's little carve-out in the north. He looked up from the ranger to Alaron and said, Alaron, are there any Frumantari or veteran explorers in the interior fortress on standby? Over another loud series of choking coughs from the crippled ranger, Alaron replied, Your favorite twisted hairs Frumentarius just got back from a mission at Denver, Lord Interfector. The elite said, Perfect. Grab one of our scouting op orders and send him west to report whatever means of crossing the rangers are using in northern Arizona to Kaiser directly. Looking back down at the ranger, the Interfector added, I'm sure whatever he finds will give Kaiser reason to finally leave the palace. Right away, Lord Interfector, said Alaron before grabbing one of the scouting orders from the desk that was unspeckled in blood and running out the door. After Alaron left to find the Frumentarius, the ranger was still in terrible pain, but had just heard what was going to happen in the near future. He didn't know what would come of it when the Legion finally diverted their full attention to the west, or if they even would, but the idea of men like the elite marching on Nevada frightened him to his core. Still with that ranger's defiance, even in the face of uncertainty or certain doom, the ranger managed to sputter his last thoughts to his captor. Despite the words being nearly unintelligible through the broken jaw and missing teeth, the ranger shouted, Thinking about marching on NCR now? Go ahead. You can find the dam, ain't too hard if you find our routes through the cliffs. Give it a try. NCR has been hearing about you all for years and they're ready for you. Slaving scum like you can do whatever you want out here, but don't think for 1 second that you'll make home anywhere near NCR. This is what was pieced together from the ranger's broken speech. Gabriella was still frantically writing the words above, trying to decipher them through the man's bloody pouring mouth and pained breaths. Her pen continued to move across the page eloquently, and her handwriting was only slightly shaken when the Interfector's gun forever silenced the young ranger. Act 5. Setting the stage. Little change in the next month after the Interfector sent the Frumentarius west, but more of the forces under the Circle Junction Praetor were dispatched to northwest Arizona to lead distraction and diversionary efforts against the rangers of that territory. The trip from Circle Junction to the Grand Canyon region was long and more than treacherous. Between the Grand Canyon itself and steep cliffs of the region, that part of Arizona had long been something of a no-man's land, despite being under Caesar's banner. It is because of the environment there that the Ranger War lasted so long and had been a less than noteworthy war. Coupled with the fact that very few Legion garrisons and outposts dotted the region. It should be no wonder that the war against the Rangers in that part of Legion territory had been considered more of a side issue than anything. Still, the Interfector was right. The worsening pain from that thorn in the Legion side was due to the increase in resources pooled together by the Desert Ranger/NCR Ranger unification. Little is known about why the NCR Rangers ramped up their attacks against the Legion, since that territory was largely forgotten by them, other than perhaps the noble nature of the Arizona Rangers mission. Since the fall of Phoenix in late 2261, the Desert Rangers watched the city fall, and those few who made it out gathered their strength with the help of their brothers in Nevada. It is believed that those Arizona Desert Rangers were scarred by the fall of Phoenix after learning the new power of the Legion, and thus saw it as their duty to battle them in whatever way possible. After years of doing what they could, and even while the Legion conquered New Mexico, then later moved into Colorado, the Rangers' mission in Arizona was never really significant. Once the Ranger unification was signed in 2271, the Desert Rangers across the Southwest continued to pursue their mission of battling slavers like the Legion, but with the added strength of the NCR at their backing. Despite the unification, the Desert Rangers still largely operated on their own in the Mojave Wasteland, as well as Upper Arizona. But after the NCR's war against the Raiders of California was over, and after their war against the California Brotherhood of Steel was looking more like a victory, the NCR diverted its full attention to the Mojave Wasteland. This effort was slow at first, but upon discovery of the Hoover Dam by NCR scouts in 2274, the dam was seized. And the crossroads into northern Arizona allowed for an even bigger increase in their attacks on the Legion's frontier. Much of this Ranger pressure would have been ignored like before if it wasn't for the silence from Caesar in late 2275 and early 2276. After the Legion's war against the Midwest BOS was ended, and during the era of silence, the Interfector's focus was diverted to that stretch of Arizona, where the Ranger skirmishes were seen as a worsening problem, since people like the Interfector were no longer spending much of the days allocating resources to the front in eastern Colorado. Addressing this Ranger issue in full focus and interrogations like the one previously led to the question of why are these Ranger attacks worsening? Though Hoover Dam, the new gate into Arizona and bridge for increased Ranger attacks, was largely unknown to the Legion, the dispatching of that frumentarius to the west would soon discover it. By the end of April 2276, the frumentarius had done as the Interfector directed and reported his discovery to Caesar at the palace in Flagstaff. After many days navigating back through the hostile terrain and cliffs of northwest Arizona and around the Grand Canyon, he stepped before Caesar with news of a great old world wall spanning the Colorado River, covered by soldiers of a grand nation beneath their banner, a two-headed bear. When Caesar heard the news, it wasn't more than a day later that he dispatched new orders all across the Legion for the first time since September of 2275. The silence from Lord Caesar had ended, and he immediately knew what to do. This newly discovered enemy on the bridge into the west was yet another sign that he was Caesar. The Legion's identity crisis was ended with the discovery of a new path forward, and though much of the manpower problems remained, the discovery of the dam was a signal for a grand unification of what was already under the bull. Many of the Legion's forces in the east were pulled from the border to Colorado, and the diminished garrisons across Arizona and New Mexico were consolidated in only a fraction of their previous stations, largely around pre-war towns. Gone were the days of territorial forces and regular patrols. The Legion's armies were moved to these key locations across the territories, and camps were packed up left and right. Garrisons that watched over auxilia tribes were too shifted to these new stations, and though the mass mobilization or shift in Legion forces was puzzling to many, it wouldn't be long before the majority of those auxilia tribes were enlightened to the reason. The Legion split into three sections during this time. There remained the Army of the East, led by Caesar himself, with the assistance of minor legates and Lord Carnifex. Then there was the army of the legatus Joshua Graham that was pulled from western Colorado and Utah. Then lastly, there were the forces of the governors or praetors, who were given a new responsibility of overseeing the consolidation of Legion forces across Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado. While the armies of the East dispersed across the territory to aid in the praetors' consolidation works, the army under Graham was moved to northern Arizona for a specific purpose that was not illuminated in the first set of new orders from Caesar. As the Interfector aided the consolidation effort how he could, his orders were rather scarce since the praetorship of Circle Junction dealt less with allied towns, but rather supplies and the administration of forces across the whole of northern Arizona and New Mexico. Since Circle Junction was still the industrial heart of the Legion, there was little for him to do in the new orders other than continue his war against the Rangers. Another 2 months went by after the new orders, and the Interfector was largely left alone. This changed for him when the next set of orders were dispatched, after the army under Graham was situated in northern Arizona, and after the consolidation of forces was complete. That next set of orders had the Interfector removed from his station at the head of Circle Junction and then sent him into the northwest section of Arizona. The elite was still vocal about the Legion's manpower concerns, but was told that it would be handled shortly and that his new task was to lead the effort in clearing the way to Hoover Dam. And so, the Interfector's Circle Junction subordinate, Centurion Cassius, was installed as the praetor of Circle Junction, while the Interfector and Aileron headed to northwestern Arizona, leading a full-strength cohort to battle the Rangers while clearing the old highways and collapsed roads around that region. The elite didn't mind this new assignment as much as he thought, since he knew that he was at least partially responsible for the end of Caesar's silence. The Interfector knew that Caesar was aware of his past, and so the man felt honored that he was leading the way for the first engagement against the NCR. It should be noted that Caesar never officially gave intel about what was happening, or where he was shifting his focus during this mobilization period, but the Interfector knew, and was glad that he wasn't put in charge of Caesar's solution to the manpower problem. Once the Interfector began his work in northwest Arizona, Montano was given his first orders in the mobilization, and that was to assist the forces of the East in their new task. By the third month after the silence ended, the consolidation was over. Legion lands were more vacant of Legion forces than they'd been before the Arizona and New Mexico campaigns, and the Arizona campaign was reopened. Caesar's solution to the manpower problem of this time was to specifically target many of the tribes across Arizona and New Mexico that had previously served the Legion as auxiliaries. The majority of these tribes were in Arizona, but this happened all over Legion territory, and it wasn't long after the first tribe fell to fabricated charges that many of the others fought back. Some auxilia tribes didn't know what was happening until it was too late, but even tribes like the Twisted Hares were not spared from this betrayal that was seen as something long overdue in Legion eyes. Though it would take many months for all of these targeted tribes to be tamed, the forces of the East led this effort with the assistance of the Frumentariae, who aided largely in the beginning of the betrayal. Frumentaria work was usually limited, since all it really took was for one tribe to be labeled a traitor before the next 3 prior auxiliaries rebelled. With much of the traitors being tamed, nearly all of the prior allies in Arizona were integrated into the Legion's ranks to mixed results. As stated previously, many of the auxiliaries had fought by the Legion's side for years, and some were inclined to side with the Legion even during the betrayal. But still, the big betrayal of the auxiliaries in 2276 almost completely tarnished the name Auxilia, although it was so long ago. Many Auxilia tribes had kept an eye on the Legion after the fall of the Twin Mothers tribe, and as the Meat Grinder campaign went on, some tribes knew it would only be a matter of time before this happened. That said, some of the prior auxilias fought back tremendously, being well familiar with Legion tactics. Still, despite the manpower problems across Legion territory, Caesar's forces were still a terrible force to be reckoned with, and one by one the old auxiliaries fell. With the betrayal being so drastic, and despite the resistance from formerly allied tribes, the auxiliary absorption was still a net gain towards bolstering the Legion's manpower. It wasn't quite enough to fix the problem started with the 4-year Meat Grinder campaign, but it at least made up for the losses from the Boss War. Despite it all, the event was enormous and tragic, and even though it did indeed help the Legion, the Auxilia name would never mean what it once did. All across Legion land, it became widely known that anyone who sided with the Legion would eventually become part of it. Autonomy proved to only be a temporary status until Caesar saw fit to consume. So with Montano happily assisting in this eradication effort, he remained occupied with one Arizona tribe after another, constantly taming one village only for the next set of villages to cement their own status as traitors by fighting back against the Legion aggressors. As this short and focused campaign went on, the enemies didn't need to be revealed by explorer scouts or the Frumentariae. Less than 2 months into this pacification, Caesar pulled the Frumentarii from the territories and held a personal meeting with the elite spy corps in the Flagstaff Palatiae. There it was made known to the spies and elite commanders what Caesar's next true target was. The Interfector continued his new job clearing the roads to Hoover Dam and pushing back the Rangers, even as scouts and spies passed his encamped force, finding new places to cross the Colorado and into the West. It was very clear that Caesar intended to go all out in this coming war. As more allies were silenced across the land, nearly half of Caesar's spies were sent into the West under various assignments, while the other half continued to assist the pacification effort and keep watch over independent townships across Arizona and New Mexico. Finally, September of 2276 arrived. After 6 months of silence from Caesar, and after another 6 months of mobilization across the Legion, nearly all of the Arizona auxiliaries were forcefully assimilated into the Legion's ranks. Caesar's spies were already reporting intel on the West, and the routes to Hoover Dam were getting clearer by the day. Some may be wondering where Legate Graham was during this, and the answer is that he was still on standby. It was imperative that the Legion did not look like they were marching on Hoover Dam. So, the forces under Lord Interfector were doing their work along the Old World roads and keeping their advance against the Rangers strong enough to drive them back, but not strong enough to cause any alarm against the NCR and their dam. Still, getting constantly pushed back since mid-2276 was very concerning to the Rangers. Their continuous failed raids and recon showing more Legion forces in the area than usual caused a different alarm to sound. The Rangers eventually worried that presence of the force under Lord Interfector was a sign that it was time for them to draw back their attacks. As a bulk of the Rangers withdrew from northwestern Arizona, they feared an even bigger response from the Legion if they didn't cease what they were doing. So the Rangers were pulled completely out of northwestern Arizona for other matters around NCR territory and the Mojave. Little did they know, their withdrawal to keep the Legion away from the dam was exactly what Caesar was waiting for. And so, in October 2276, Legatus Graham's forces were taken off standby and ordered to join the Interfector's force, 30 miles from Hoover Dam. With Graham on the march, the Interfector continued his slow and covert work, and the forces of the East were still handling the prior auxiliary holdouts. Montano, on the other hand, recently stood victorious after his role in the assimilation of the former Atomic Stalkers Auxilia tribe, and was ordered by Legate Graham himself to join the march to Hoover Dam. There was still more work to do before Caesar would attempt to cross his Rubicon, but the stage was set, and while battles still raged in Legion territory, physical battles weren't the only ones certain Legion commanders were fighting. When you know you're the bad guy. Mid-October 2276. There at the Interfector's encampment in northwestern Arizona, Alaron stood atop a small cliff looking out at the sentry posts and watchtowers keeping eye on the north. Alaron's eyes followed the decayed old road north winding around the distant rock formations and ending at the far-off collapsed section where nearly 50 slaves were continuing their excavation work. He wished that stealth wasn't a priority because the use of dynamite would have completed this entire project weeks ago. His mind went to thoughts about the innumerable paths in the cliffs they'd uncovered that were used by the Rangers, and briefly wished the Legion could use those since the last skirmish against the Rangers was nearing 2 weeks ago. As silent as those paths have been, and despite how useful they'd been for explorer reconnaissance groups, he knew it was still likely that the Rangers would be brought back to the region if there was too much attention brought to them by sentries filing through them towards their newly disclosed target. No. The roads had to be cleared, as slow as the effort was. The roads offered ample room for logistics and supply forces to supplement the coming march, something the narrow and dangerous cliff passes prevented. The sun had just begun to lower from its highest point, and the heat of northern Arizona was beating down on him like never before, despite the time of year, as he continued to survey the distant slaves' progress. Finally, one of the runners stepped up to him, greeted him with a salute that Alaron wordlessly returned, and told Alaron about the completion of the objective as a folded paper was placed in Alaron's hand. The runner was dismissed, and Alaron then turned back to the Interfector's command tent, walking back to see if his Primus needed anything and report the recent accomplishment of that minor errand. Passing the 2 veterans by the entry flap, Alaron entered to see his Primus sitting at the fold-out table desk before the standard fire pit, scribbling away on a stack of papers, drafting new orders, taking inventories, and noting progress on the cliffs. In the corner of the room beside his cot and belongings was Gabriella sitting beside Amethyst, who had the toddler named Abel in her arms. The 2 slaves looked up at Alaron's entry, and the elite continued what he was doing. Stepping before the desk, Alaron gave his salute, and the slaves resumed what they were doing as Alaron said, "Ave Primus, your investigation has been completed." Alaron extended the letter slightly, and without looking up from what he was doing, the Interfector continued writing as he said, "Place it on the stack here, please, and thank you." Alaron placed the folded paper on the stack of documents and waited there silently for several seconds, hearing the pen continuously move across the paper. He hadn't been given the telepathic directive to take a seat, so he knew the elite was almost done. Alaron continued to stare at the wall above the Interfector's unprotected head and heard that pen move quicker and quicker, an indication that the elite was about to sign. The elite's pen gave the distinctive sound it made whenever he was making his signature, and at the sound of that final tap, Alaron was instructed to meet the face of his Primus. As the Interfector looked up and leaned back, "I could go for a break right now." Alaron remained silent, but nodded in acknowledgement, and the elite stood from the table, taking the folded letter with him as he moved towards the women by Alaron's cot. The women looked up at the elite's approach and watched him as he sat beside Amethyst there on the floor. The Interfector gestured for the child scarcely more than 2, and took the boy in his arms, silently whispering things as Amethyst looked to him lovingly. Alaron approached the circle where the slaves and his Primus were sitting, and was then ordered to take a seat as well. He did so, not used to sitting on the ground outside of the field, and was asked in an inside voice, as the elite continued rocking the child. What was the outcome of that investigation? Alaron said how the details were scarce, and that details were likely in the folded paper. Struggling to unfold the letter with the child in his arms, he offered the letter back to Alaron with his free hand. Alaron took it and read the thing as he'd been known to do. Without reading any more than what was absolutely necessary, Alaron was something of a speed reader, and learned all that was in the letter within less than a couple seconds. Alaron said, "It's as we expected, but there's little else to do. Nothing further could be ascertained about the possible homosexuality of Centurion Clementius. It is reported that the slave suspect is no longer with the 58th century, and Clementius reported to have killed the suspected slave before a true interrogation could be conducted. This report is corroborated by sentries at Watchpost 12B on Peak 89, who said the Centurion was seen escorting the slave into the unwatched ravine down to the Colorado 2 nights ago. The same vigils said that only the Centurion returned from that trip, apparently limping from some kind of injury. When asked about this, Centurion Clementius said that the slave fought back before being put down and explained his absence of staff during the execution was due to his wish to not garner any suspicion from the slave about his impending doom. When asked about the reason for executing the slave, he reported it being for repeatedly malingering during duties at the road excavation. Centurion Clementius appears completely unaware of the investigation into his activities. When Alaron finished with the report, the Interfector looked up to meet him as he continued to rock the young Abel, and said softly with a smirk, "I'll bet Clementius was tipped off about the investigation somehow and tried to get rid of the evidence." He let loose a light chuckle before speaking his thoughts aloud. Even if the slave wasn't executed, I wouldn't be too surprised if Clementius decided to set his partner free. Perhaps I'll ask the men at Watchpost 13A if they saw any figures trying to cross the Colorado a few nights back. They should have had a better view of that stretch to the Colorado. One way or another, it would still appear that the issue sorted itself out. Consider this matter ended. Alaron nodded, placing the paper in the pouch on his left breastplate, and all of them there on the ground remained silent for a long while. The Interfector turned back to his son's face and resumed whispering things to the child as Alaron began considering how else to assist his Primus. Occasionally noticing Gabriella shifting her gaze between the Interfector child and himself. Alaron would have reprimanded her for ocularly asking that question. "Where's my child, Master Alaron?" If he wasn't too caught in his own head about other means of assisting his Primus in this long waiting game. After another long silence, the elite looked back up to Alaron saying, "Still thinking about joining the Praetorians, Alaron?" Alaron hadn't been thinking about that at the time he was asked that question. So Alaron chalked the question up to another means of small talk that the Interfector enjoyed on occasion. Alaron replied honestly, "Not at this moment, Lord Interfector. I still consider it some nights when not focused on other matters, however." The elite nodded with a smile, completely aware of the way Alaron thought, and added, "I hear Lucius became the head of the guard a few weeks back. I always liked dealing with him, so I'm sure I could get you a good bit of intel on who's weakest, or strongest if you ever decide you want to do that." Alaron appreciated that and would have smiled if smiling wasn't for the weak, or for men of exceptional brilliance, renown, and heroism, like his Primus. Instead, Alaron replied directly, "That would be most appreciated, my Primus. I may ask for such a favor pending the outcome of our current directives." Immediately, Lord Interfector said, "Speaking of, you receive any intel on that twisted hairs frumentarius I like? Could use a guy like that for scouting up ahead." Alaron was aware of the man his Primus was talking about, but was also briefly shocked that the elite would mention the name Twisted Hairs, since they learned what happened to them in a report they received not more than 2 weeks prior. Then it occurred to him that the report lacked information about whether or not that name was to be erased completely from future discussions. In such cases, that usually meant that the name wasn't outlawed, but merely frowned upon in Legion terms. the same thought occurred to the elite as well, and despite seeing that specific frumentarius name in countless scouting reports and direct interactions over the years, neither man could remember it for the life of them. Still, the mentioned spy was one they were well familiar with, and when both concluded that the Twisted Hare's frumentarius was as good a name as they could get, Alaron replied, "I believe he was called to the Flagstaff Palati a while back for the meeting there." The Interfector kissed the child on the forehead and handed him back to Amethyst, who eagerly accepted him. The elite then stretched his legs out and adjusted in his place after holding the child firmly for so long before saying to Alaron, "That's right. Think he was one of the ones sent west after that meeting." He paused, and a look of concern and contemplation grew across his face before he resumed. "Probably good for him to get away for a while given all that happened to his home tribe a couple months back. Sorta wish I didn't give him a respite period after reporting this Hoover Dam place to Caesar. I certainly would have kept him close if I knew Caesar was going to do that. Can't imagine having to watch that while you're home on break." The elite gave one more long pause before concluding. "Hope he knows that wasn't my intention and doesn't hold it against me personally." The Interfector was then quiet with his thoughts, and Alaron remembered the day he heard about the mass betrayal of the Auxilia sometime before hearing about the Twisted Hare's fate. At the time, the man was still very busy with the work being done in this region, but Alaron saw a darkness in the man's face that lingered for a long time. The elite always was a big advocate for the Auxilia, and while Alaron still internally celebrated their formal integration into the Legion ranks proper, the Interfector was piecing together possible reasons why he was sent to this area in the first place. Regardless of what the elite would have done after hearing Caesar's order of fate, by the time the news reached the Interfector, the mourning period had passed. What's done was done, or already too in motion to stop, and the elite focused on the task ahead while that darkness stayed on his countenance for many days after. Alaron saw the revival of that troubling situation on his lord's face and tried to ease the Interfector's apparent concern. He shouldn't hold anything against his commander, Primus. He's been an exceptional asset to Lord Caesar as well as yourself for many years. When Alaron noticed that did little to halt the elite's droll feeling, Alaron added, "If anything, he won't think too highly of his brother in the Frumentaria Volpes." The Interfector's face lightened up slightly, probably. That guy Volpes always was something else. "Did I ever tell you he used to go by?" The elite stopped himself and looked towards the entrance. All of them on the floor were silent and looked to the Interfector, curious about the interruption. There in the silence and just beyond the tent flap, they could all hear the muffled sounds of a large force marching. Upon making sense of the noise, the Interfector stood himself up with the words, "Already? We weren't expecting them for another week." Alaron joined his Primus, and together they marched to the entrance, exited the tent, and emerged to the sight of a large force entering the encampment. What looked like an estimated 5 centuries had arrived in the already sprawling camp and began setting up. Before taking any more notice of the massive arrival, their attention was quickly diverted to the man in jeans, a pair of boots, and a white shirt beneath a black old world tactical vest surrounded by 12 Praetorians in the camp center. The elite and Alaron stepped up to the man, immediately identified by the two as Legatus Graham as he was dusting himself off. When the pair was close enough, they dropped to their knees at the same time, and each gave a salute as the elite spoke. "My Legatus, pardon the lack of preparation for your arrival." The two met the sunken but naturally fiery eyes of the man with slick-back dark gray hair atop his head as the simple words, "Rise, both of you," came from the second most powerful man in the Legion. Alaron and the elite stood, and a sad smile stretched across the legate's face as he added, "No need to worry, Lord Interfector. I came here with this cohort on a separate matter. Still, the force I was truly charged with has been making excellent time and should be here sooner than anticipated as well." The elite of Phoenix was about to ask about this separate matter that required a full-strength cohort, but Legate Graham's back was already turned to his Praetorian staff, who was ordered to stay put and oversee the encampment duties. When the Legatus Imperialis turned back around, Graham's face said he would answer any question soon. Accompanying this was the silent order for Alaron and the elite to follow. Legate Graham led the two back into the elite's personal tent, and upon seeing who entered, both of the slave women stood in an instant. Amethyst momentarily panicked about whether or not she should set the young Abel down or keep him in her arms before the presence of the legatus, but before she could determine one or the other, Graham was right in front of her. Both Amethyst and Gabriella were silent and completely terrified of the powerful man before them, but Legate Graham's face said anything but terror. His eyes looked gently at the young boy, his face covered in deep lines from 2 decades of constant stress and war. Amethyst no longer needed to rock the child, who stared quietly at the legate since her arms were still trembling, despite knowing what the legatus was like from prior encounters. Finally, the legate said softly, barely able to be heard by either Alaron or the elite, "This must be the young Abel you mentioned." The elite replied from his distant place near the entryway, "Yes, my legatus." The legate briefly looked to the elite and then back to the boy, adding again softly, "Such a fine child. Been a long time since I've seen innocence like him." The Interfector wondered how or if he should respond until the legate met the eyes of Amethyst and then Gabriella. "Ladies, would you care to leave us for now?" He was about to explain why, but remembered how he didn't need to at the sight of their immediate nods and soft replies. As the women filed towards the entrance with the boy, the elite instructed them to use Alaron's tent that he hadn't been using, and looked to the legate, who turned to the commanders with a stern countenance that somehow said something else. Something unexpectedly uncertain, something that slightly resembled some sort of tragedy or even defeat mixed with what overtly looked like tremendous exhaustion. This expression couldn't be figured by either man, but before Alaron or the elite could consider it much further, Legate Graham gestured towards the Interfector's seat at the desk and asked softly, "May I take your spot, Lord Interfector?" Immediately, the elite said, "By all means," and was quietly instructed to take a seat. Alaron was also ordered to join his primus on the other side of the table, and when both were situated, Graham met the eyes of the elite with the permission to drop his legion demeanor. Alaron was incapable of this, so he remained silent as his primus said semi-jovially, "How on earth have you been, Graham? Before you were put on the march, last I heard, you were killed by a tribal sharpshooter or something out in Utah." Graham's face brightened up for the slightest second before his face fell back to its rather stressed state as he said, "Suspected Rangers, actually." The elite's face fell to a gloomy one as well as he replied, "That far out, huh? We've beaten them back here in Arizona, but I had no idea they'd been operating out there too." Graham said, "Don't worry about it. The assassination didn't take." He was about to chuckle, but instead resumed, "This war has been a long time coming. Elite of Phoenix." The elite nodded, and his expression picked up again as he said, "And that's why you were moved out here. Glad Caesar's letting me join the spearhead." He paused, and another slight grin grew across the elite's face before he asked the legatus, "Are you excited? I know I personally have been waiting to take the fight to NCR since I first became an elite." "Not as much as you are, I'm certain," said Graham, half involved. The man was more busy trying to pull something out of the leather satchel hanging by his belt. Once accomplished, Graham placed a small stack of folded documents on the table. As Graham began setting out the papers and organizing them into some type of order, the elite continued to observe the face of Graham. The legatus had always been a stern and calculated man, even when they first met way back in 2261. Since then, however, the elite had seen Graham only ever so scarcely. Every few years when the two finally met up again, both men had done a lot of aging, Graham seemingly more so than the Interfector. When the Interfector first met Graham, the legate was scarcely more than 30, had a full head of dark brown hair, and was full of military conviction in every word he spoke. Since then, the elite had only seen the legate on a few notable occasions, and the lines on his face appeared to get deeper while his flaming eyes sunk lower. That flame still flickered in his eyes even at this point, but now he was over the edge of 50. And years of terrible reputation showed in those same eyes like a pile of bright embers rather than a roaring inferno. Alaron continued to avert his gaze from the legate's face until instruction, but the relationship between the elite of Phoenix and Legate Graham allowed the elite to study the face even further, clearly able to notice that particular something that was amiss. Finally, Legate Graham had organized all the papers accordingly on the desk, but just before he could resume, the elite asked, "You seem different, my legate. Is everything all right? Graham let the question linger as he double-checked the document's order before saying sternly to the papers, "Yes, I just have a lot on my mind." Though the elite didn't ask anything else, Legatus Graham could feel that his answer didn't answer the question. After a moment, he added again, refusing to make eye contact. "Before moving down here, I was still working with the tribes of eastern Utah." He paused once more before again saying to the papers, "Something happened." The elite thought maybe it was the assassination attempt he was referring to, but was told by the legate's face that wasn't it. Because of this, the elite asked plainly, "What was it?" Legatus Graham was done setting out the papers, but instead of looking up to the elite, Graham looked up to Alaron, who was still looking next to the face of the legate. Lord Interfector saw what looked like an apologetic expression on the legate's glance at Alaron before looking back down at the papers and saying, "Doesn't matter." Accompanying that was the internal order to leave it at that for the moment, before Graham looked up to meet the Interfector, adding, "I'm here to give you a new task, Lord Interfector." The elite internally acknowledged, and the legate went on pointing to each relevant paper as he spoke. "You'll still be fighting NCR, but Caesar wants you to cut their throat in the east." Pointing to the maps, Graham continued as the elite followed along with his eyes. The place is a settlement in Death Valley consisting of two old world towns called Hopeville and Ashton, referred to by some of the locals as the Divide. Several members of the Frumontaria are working there now and report the settlement as a large supply line between the Mojave and California. You are to take the cohort I brought with me today and invade the two towns. Your assignment is to erase opposition and hold your ground for a maximum of 2 months after arrival while we take the dam and secure Vegas. You will be getting reinforcements after the dam falls, but holding that route directly from the west of Vegas is paramount. I won't lie when I say this will be a dangerous assignment. It isn't often that cohorts have to operate independently for so long, but you are being sent because Caesar knows you have a way with the locals of any region you operate. Silencing the NCR and the blocking of that route is a must, so use your resources and keep the populace on your side enough to prevent external intervention. Most people of the West have no interaction with our forces, so it's best any people encountered know little about the kind of ruthlessness of other Legion commanders. That said, just do what you do best. Cut down any opposition, and leave the rest alone. The two commanders met eyes again, and the elite internally agreed, while a quick glance at the map gave birth to a question that was seen on the Interfector's face. Lord Interfector asked about the route to get there since it appeared as though there were plenty of obstacles in the way and given the shaded areas marking NCR territory in the Mojave. The means of getting so far behind their lines with such a sizable force looked nearly impossible. Legatus Graham sought to address this by mentioning the Frumontaria reports about the region. Pointing at each relevant part of the map, the legate went on. "They say to avoid this stretch here that locals have labeled a dead zone leading to a place known only as Big Empty. Nobody knows what happens to those who stray too close to the desert plains leading to the mountain itself, but local intel says everything from lack of freshwater availability to the superstitious that isn't worth mentioning. Either way, the region has prevented the construction of NCR supply lines from the north as well, so it's best to avoid the area altogether." Going over the technicals of the route, the Interfector found himself questioning the route to reach the Mojave itself. Graham answered that as well as he elaborated on the task's particulars and general notes accompanying each point along the route. "You should keep your forces disguised as refugees and separate to travel in small groups when necessary. Caesar has ordered attacks along southern Utah to create causation for a refugee crisis and distract the rangers and border guards along the northern Mojave territory. It should also be noted that contact has been made already with a number of the local Mojave raiders, so feel free to travel through their territory as needed. However, the Great Khans have recently suffered a terrible defeat against NCR forces, so avoid this region as much as possible. NCR forces are sure to be crawling all over this section of the route for the foreseeable future, but as I said, travel in small groups as you see fit to avoid suspicion." The elite gave the appropriate acknowledgments and listened intently as the legatus continued. "The trip around the canyon in Mojave territory shouldn't take more than 2 months, and once you and the cohort arrive at the Pyramid Peak rally point, I leave the dealing of NCR's Death Valley supply line to you. There's still plenty to do in preparation for our assault on Hoover Dam, so you'll have ample time to deal with this accordingly." Although I'll expect your primary objective to be done before the end of the first month of 77. You'll again be operating independently until the dam is secure, but the frumentaria in the region will be at your disposal, and that route to the Mojave must be eliminated one way or another before our assault. I'll say once more that the forces I brought today are yours. So make your plans, study my orders, and I'll expect you to set out by the end of the week in order to keep our timetable. At that, the legate was done, and the elite was still going over a number of the documents on the table for several silent seconds afterward. Finally, when the elite had understood all he needed to and knowing that he would have plenty of time to study along the way, Lord Interfector inhaled deeply as he reclined back in the chair. To signal his readiness for his role in this grand invasion of the West, Lord Interfector stretched his legs out once more and turned his head to Aileron as he said, "Hear that, Aileron? Let's get packing." Immediately, Aileron began to stand when suddenly he was halted mid-rise by the legate. Actually, hold that thought, elite. Aileron lingered in place for a moment before sitting back down slowly at the legate's momentary silence. When Aileron was seated, Legatus Graham looked to the elite and said, "Lord Interfector, I would like to ask your permission to have Aileron temporarily reassigned to my command for assistance at the dam." Lord Interfector was hesitant for a moment at the thought of losing his right hand even temporarily, but knew it was impossible for him to say no to the Legion's Legatus Imperialis regardless of his personal relationship with the man. So, the elite said to Graham, "You don't need permission from me, my Legatus." Studying the elite's expression and knowing how close the two were, Legate Graham said concerningly, "You aren't too sure, are you, Lord Interfector?" "It's not that," said the elite simply before Graham added. "The Legion and the staff under my oncoming forces lacks in manners of efficiency, veterancy, and combat effectiveness in the way that you speak so highly about regarding Aileron." The legate again paused, seeing the misfortune in the elite's face at the idea of losing Aileron. Finally, Graham added, "Tell you what, I'll let you decide." Not feeling it was his place, the elite concluded that it wasn't his decision to make, not even the legate's, but Aileron's decision. So, being one of the last remaining commanders of this caliber in the Legion, the elite of Phoenix made his decision by asking Aileron, "Aileron, is joining Legatus Graham agreeable to you?" Knowing what he was doing by asking Aileron to make the decision, Lord Interfector wasn't all that surprised when Aileron turned to meet the face of his Primus for so many years with the words, "Anything my Legatus desires of me." For the briefest moment, Lord Interfector felt like his loyal dog and best friend of many years had just sided with the stranger holding a treat. But the feeling vanished as quick as it came before the legate said, "Excellent. Your transfer to my command is much appreciated, Centurion Aileron." Aileron was about to reply appropriately, but the elite was quicker with the response when he said idly, "Hate to lose him, Graham, but may he serve you well." He paused again, and Graham nodded at the elite with a face of concern, allowing the elite to add, "I'd also appreciate his return to me at this Death Valley place when you send the backup, my legate." Graham nodded understandingly in agreement to the request, and his face fell again to that unusual expression. The elite noticed this revival of tragedy in the legate's face, and the look of defeat appeared even deeper in the lines on Graham's face. For the faintest second, Graham's face gave the elite a vague premonition that it was indeed best for Aileron to accompany him instead of the elite. This expression emblazoned on the legate's face once more gave rise to the original question about his demeanor, and that question constructed itself in the elite's mind further when the glance he gave Aileron earlier finally made sense. The silence after the transfer continued until the elite formulated the question. The legate saw this, and both of them knew that the business had concluded for now. Both men internally landed on the same issue that was needing address, and the legate's next words after the long silence were to Aileron, "Centurion Aileron, could you please give us a minute?" Aileron acknowledged his first order received under the legate's formal command by standing up, saluting the two, and stating, "True to Caesar," for both men who only nodded in recognition of the dismissal. Both the elite and Legatus Imperialis continued to stare at one another silently, each with their own questions on their minds as Aileron exited the tent and took his place on a small bench next to the command tent's wall facing his personal tent. Aileron looked through the open mouth of his personal tent, watching the two slave women joyfully playing with the young boy there on the ground as he thought about his future service to the legatus. Graham and the elite were silent for a long time after Aleron's departure, as some particular thought neither man could figure was weighing on both of them. The inability to grasp or understand what that thought was nearly infuriated both men. But Lord Interfector had the most questions in his mind, and since he couldn't understand that unknown thought, he decided to seek answers for those regarding the man before him. Lord Interfector finally ended the silence by asking softly, "What exactly happened in Utah, Graham?" The legate looked up and into the eyes of the elite, staying silent again for several seconds before answering softly, "I've just done a lot of thinking lately. Probably for the first time in a long time." He paused to look even deeper at the man across the table. Legatus Graham had always liked the Interfector, and though he had only seen him so few times over the many years, that admiration grew. He honestly didn't expect the elite to survive too long after the fall of Phoenix. And seeing constant assurances of his survivability over the years made him admire the name, Interfector, more and more, while at the same time, it sickened him. Graham had known the man, even if briefly, before he became the Interfector of Phoenix, and their relationship was a strange one. Still, Legatus Graham knew who the Interfector was before the title, and even though he was one of few living Legion commanders that had memorable life before Legion servitude, Graham's mind was troubled by something even a man like the elite probably couldn't even begin to comprehend. Much of this was because of his own role in creating the elite before him. Graham had been alone in the world for so long, surrounded by men who didn't know life before the Legion. And being surrounded by men so alien to yourself creates a kind of isolation that is unbearable when compared with a life that was. None of this feeling was relieved over the years he'd spent in eastern Utah, teaching the tribals of the land ruthless warfare. Especially when he remembered earlier years of his life spent in the same land for very different reasons. Looking at the legitimate concern in the Interfector's gaze, he remembered what was in store for himself and all those dreams in the wilderness of Utah, seeing the embodiment of error after error in the real sympathy within the murderer of Phoenix's eyes. Constantly getting lost and losing each battle of the mental war within, Graham was too tired to keep fighting. Regardless of the elite's ability to truly understand the types of wars he was fighting regularly, Graham met the eyes of his creation across the table, saying in a dead manner, and uncaring of the words he himself spoke, "I just feel I've let someone very important to me down." The look of tired death appeared on Graham's face even more as the words, "He knows what I've done, and all the mistakes I've ever made are finally, after so long, catching up," crept out his mouth in an exhausted manner. Legatus Graham continued staring past the elite, looking like he was near death as the embers in those eyes got even dimmer. The elite's face never changed. He looked at the legate's tired shell, deeply concerned and worried. Recalling times he'd seen the legate's wrath in full fury, he believed every story he heard about the legate standing over piles of burning corpses across Arizona and New Mexico. Lord Interfector couldn't believe any of those stories anymore when he looked at the half-dead man across the table, and was more worried for the man than he knew how to handle. Finally, the elite asked hesitantly, "Was this important man Caesar?" Another burst of flames erupted in the legate's eyes despite no change in his statue-like composure. The second of the Legion shook his head slightly as the words, "No, not him," slid from his mouth. The elite wondered what else to ask, but the legate's words said there was something else he needed to say. Both remained quiet once more until the flames in Graham's eyes cooled back down to embers. Finally, the legatus ended his 1,000-yard stare and locked eyes with the elite as he resumed in his dead way. "I know we don't talk much these days, but I know you're different from other commanders." The type of men they were was an even bigger means of relationship that both had bonded over during the years of isolated contact. The elite thought about this fact as Legatus Graham went on. "You remember things before Caesar. I don't need to explain what we are to you. You and I aren't indoctrinated into believing something false. Guys like us, we know we're the bad guys." For another silent moment, Lord Interfector was shocked by the legate's words. The shock wasn't from the accusation, but from the reminder of something he'd long repressed. Yes, the Interfector knew he was a bad guy, but he'd spent years keeping himself busy with service to Caesar and attempting to personally indoctrinate himself into believing the nobility of his position. This attempt worked in the day-to-day, But he did in fact naturally have a demeanor completely contrary to the typical servant of Caesar in the way he dealt with everyone, officer, slave, and otherwise. On the many occasions that being good got in the way of service, he was more than willing to crush that goodness with the hammer of servitude, absolving himself of blame and allowing him to sleep, while completely avoiding the overall sum of his characterization, saying he was a bad guy. Feeling the same sense of defeat at the reminder of his true being, the elite said in his own exhausted way, "Yeah, I know we're the bad guys, but that's all there is in this world, just bad." Seeing no change in the legate's state, the Interfector resumed the justification he'd used nearly every day over the years. Might as well be the worst. He paused again and chuckled to himself in that dead way, as he internally acknowledged what he actually was despite his conflicting heart. "It's been a few years, but I used to try my best to be a good man in this bad world, but that don't mean much in a system that's pure bad." Both stuck in their own heads, Lord Interfector contemplated his life, who he was, where he'd been, where he ended up, and all he'd done. His mind ran through every wicked deed, especially the big one that gave him his current name. That thought still disgusted him, but at the same time he wouldn't have traded it for the world. He'd accepted what this world was, and accepted who he was destined to be based on the life he lived. Lord Interfector's thoughts were interrupted when he caught the gaze of Graham, who rested his elbows on his knees as he looked at the elite, almost bursting at the seams in tremendous sorrow. "I'm so sorry I brought you into this, Drifter." The fire was completely gone from the legate's eyes, and the elite was left in shock at that address. Something was smacked back to life in him as he choked out, "Nobody's called me that in a long time, Graham." As Lord Interfector looked at the guilt-ridden thing before him that didn't resemble Caesar's second in the slightest, he asked in a stutter, too bewildered by the display and thoughts in his mind, "What's come over you?" Legatus Graham sunk lower in his place as he stared into the Interfector's eyes, looking even more like a dead man than before as he said, "I think what I did with you way back then was probably one of the worst things I've ever done. You were such a good man who could have done so much good, but I took that and destroyed it." Lord Interfector didn't know how to handle the shell of a man he so respected, or the revival of these memories he regularly justified or attempted to forget. Immediately, he replied assuredly, resigned to what he knew he was, "You didn't do anything wrong, Graham. I know I was born bad." And he stopped, thinking again about those horrible days in his earlier years and what he'd done leading up to the Legion. "I would have done something equally bad even if you never approached me with that offer." Despite the legate's unchanging expression, the fire erupted in his eyes again as something that looked like a lone tear fell, making him scoff and reply, "I'm afraid I don't believe that for one second. I can't shake that I'm personally responsible for what I turned you into." The Interfector felt the concern in his own face and deeply felt for the legate's personal guilt, but the Interfector knew that who he became was no fault of Legatus Graham. In an attempt to relieve some of the burden Graham was so obviously carrying, Lord Interfector thought about a particular instance where he realized what he'd always been. He explained to Graham as his own mental war raged in his mind. "Don't believe me?" Lord Interfector paused, unsure whether he was trying to convince himself or Graham who he was. Lord Interfector threw that thought out and went on regardless of any premise. "It was over a decade ago, and I was still new to my praetorship at Circle Junction when I knew for sure you had no role in what I did at Phoenix. I was surveying the Arizona slave quarter, going to oversee some task. I forget what exactly. But it must have been the shift change because I remember a large crowd in front of one of the forge buildings. Every slave on the street will stop in their place and bow at the approach of myself and my guard. And I remember everyone did so that particular day, all except one. One man stood while everyone else was bowing, and apparently he recognized me because he called out, 'Lord Interfector!' My attention turned, and before one of the street patrols could reach him through the crowd and make him bow, he shouted, 'Fuck you, you piece of shit, you destroyed my home and killed my family.' I had the man brought before me in chains there on the street. There I asked calmly if he was just using me as an outlet for some other commander, but he made it clear that he was from Phoenix and spat on me, saying I was personally responsible. I didn't feel bad, ashamed, or even angry about what I did or how he reacted. I merely resumed my errand, having him follow along in chains until I was done with my business in the slave quarter. When I returned to the interior fortress, I said no other words, but had him chained to a street lamp there in the plaza. He was angry at first as the hours turned into days, and slowly he starved while water was given to keep him alive enough for starvation to be the cause of death. As time went on, his anger disappeared, and he would eventually cry and scream and beg for me to release him as I went about my daily business. It must have been day 6 or 7 or so when he was too weak to stand. I remember stopping one day on return to my residence, and I remember marveling at how he begged and begged for me to let him go, saying he would do anything, that he was sorry for what he said, and that he would take it all back. I learned what I was, what I've always been, when I knelt down to him and said, "You weren't there to save my family, so why the fuck should I have saved yours?" He died chained to that pole 2 days later, and Lord Interfector paused for a long time, seeing the story imprint itself in Graham's mind, though a tear nearly escaped from the Interfector's eyes at the remembrance of how horrible he was and truly is. He was willing to acknowledge it as he let loose a dead chuckle before saying desperately, "Isn't that the pettiest thing you ever heard?" Graham stared at the Interfector, whose recollection placed an enormous terror on his mind. Upon looking back into Graham's face, he saw the legate facing the guilt and terror eating his mind right alongside him. This understanding and sympathy he was hoping Graham would eradicate with a statement of deserving made no sense when the legate continued emanating his concern for the man who so clearly didn't deserve it. Finally, the elite managed to stutter, still defeated and resigned to the horror. It's really strange when you know you're the bad guy, and you don't really see a way or even want to be anything else anymore. He paused again, more dead than Graham after that release, seeing the legate again in his deep concern and understanding. After the story, and after a long enough silence, the whole thing did little to erase the legate's guilt about his role even in the story presented. In fact, the elite's story of cruelty only further weighed on the feeling of guilt in his mind. The elite felt as though he'd done a service by seemingly absolving Graham of any responsibility, but Graham's face sunk even more when, even after such a story, and even after the Interfector's reversion back to his wicked self-acceptance, Graham said, "Back at the gas station, I could have shown you another way to handle your tragedies and this life, a true way to thank you for saving me. But I didn't. And now, your story is even more proof that I am to blame. For that, I cannot forgive myself. One mistake after another, all in the name of duty or loyalty, but all meaningless." The Interfector was shocked to hear that, but still accepted the fate and how he turned out. Lord Interfector asked, "I think you should forgive yourself, Graham. I'm my own man, a man that can let nobody down but myself." He stopped, seeing once more the terrible plague on Graham's face, and wondered why he would blame himself so harshly for the things he'd done, and why exactly it was weighing on him now. Lord Interfector's mind thought back through every word the legatus said, and saw that the tremendous guilt in his mind stemmed from letting someone not Caesar down. Caesar, the convenient justification for everything malicious Caesar's legionaries had ever done, apparently did nothing to prevent the all-out decay and breakdown of the legate here. What on earth could Graham have done to cause such a breakdown when Caesar was the justification for this world of bad? Apparently, Caesar wasn't enough to halt what was happening to Graham, and whoever he truly let down, that person's wrath manifested unlike Caesar's. Where Caesar's wrath beheaded whole towns, burned homes, enslaved the weak, and killed the strong in the furnace of war, the wrath of Graham's, someone else, psychologically annihilated Kaiser II, a man who was the embodiment of all those atrocities that came with the bull. A man who was completely defeated in everything but battlefield reputation. Finally, the elite asked the question, "Who's this man you let down?" Graham did not want to answer that the way expected. Graham had no names to give, only because it was the name he'd been far more terrified and defiant of than Caesar. Lord Interfector himself would not be able to ever understand, but even the thought of the name on his mind made him even more horrified at what he was, what he'd done, what he refused to do, and how far that life had gotten him. After so long in the silence, Graham felt that presence he'd felt so many nights alone in the wilderness, and the horror sank further into his being when he realized he was closer than ever. Graham had no desire to face what he knew was in store for him, but he could deny his impending return no more. So many years of running led to victory at the expense of ultimate defeat. He was not ready for the return, but there was nowhere else to run. He's just someone I knew my whole life, but someone I spent so many years trying my hardest to run from. Lord Interfector already didn't know what to make of Graham's words, but the strain on the legate's face said that what he was admitting to was so real that it was literally killing him for some sense of liberation. An unbearable pain was brought to his being by confronting the reality of a man's past. He knew me and who I would be while I was in my mother's womb, and loved me anyway, still does. He did a lot for me, paid a price I could in no way earn or make up for, a price I didn't ever deserve, especially now. I took all he'd done for me and all the times I was picked up after so many falls and turned my back. Been running for so long that now, after all I've done, all the lives I've destroyed, after so many years, I can't bear to face him ever again. When he paused, the legatus appeared as though he was one more breath away from dying, but still, the man continued breathing. His eyes no longer looking at the elite, but staring straight past him in some sort of trance he clearly wished he hadn't entered. The next words out of Graham's mouth were, "Why do you persecute me?" A seeming question that required no answer when made real in its simple utterance. After another silence, the legate resumed, "I still can't pinpoint where I went from savior to killer, but there's no more denying what I've done, and it's one thing to go from killer to saved. But redemption for the one who knowingly turned away is unforgivable, even to him." Both men were then silent once more, and the Interfector, though lost in exactly what Graham was referring to, saw the enormous pain behind the fallen man's eyes. Unable to understand much else, but unwittingly knowing more than he knew, Lord Interfector brought Graham's eyes to his own before saying, "I think he'll forgive you if you ask him, since you said he knew who you'd be." The suggestion was left at that while Graham's exhausted and dead face twisted to one of inconsolable fright as he took in the words, and what that suggestion meant. The idea was one he'd heard and felt from that presence in the wilderness, but one he could never bring himself to do when he remembered all he'd done. With images of those dark nights in the presence of the spirit that drew closer and closer, his fright at the Interfector's words made him speak the revelation he tried running further from to even less avail. "I know he's already left the 99 for me, and I wish he didn't. I don't want to be saved ever again, and that's why I feel him stronger than ever, but I'm far too ashamed to ever go back. I simply can't. Not after so long." He stopped, not ready to turn, but ready to succumb to what he'd always known was in store. "I think I'm ready, though." Lord Interfector could only ask, ready for what? Graham broke his trance once more to meet the eyes of the elite, seeing the same concern on his creation's face that never left. Graham faced the fate he knew that running led to, still unable to beg forgiveness from his someone else, but now ready for it all to be over as he said, "I think I'm just about ready to die. I've been feeling it for a long time, and that presence that's haunted me these recent years is too close now. I still feel the fire, this blind hate inside, but I can't do anything about it despite rediscovering those eyes that have been watching me. I can't stop what I've become. I can't go back, but I also can't take going anymore. So death is the only thing that's next." The two were silent again for several long minutes. After admitting to the reality of his observed life, and after accepting his wicked life he subconsciously knew was rapidly coming to a close, he sat there unrepentant, ready for the end he knew he deserved, but was unwilling to even attempt to rectify. Lord Interfector could not fathom all that was truly on Graham's mind, and understood little about what had come over Graham, but he could see the clear evidence of a man who, despite the horrors in his mind, resigned himself to the same conclusion of evil that Lord Interfector had a long time ago. Where one believed his end was imminent for the final conclusion to a bad life, the other's heart remained noble despite complete helplessness in the face of an awful world both helped create. Either way, both men were absolutely exhausted from their shared actions in this world and nation under Caesar that made even the best of intentions a futile effort to counter something so monolithic and awful. Regardless of their personal tragedies, the lives they lived, whether they were good here and bad there, the sum total of their actions or moral dilemmas painted both men as bad under the bull. Both men accepted this, and both were tired, ready for whatever was next, but knowing in their hearts where life under the bull led from the very beginning. Finally, the Interfector expressed his thoughts to the broken legatus whose fiery eyes began to flicker once more at the acceptance he spoke. I think you'll be fine, Graham. But I know what you mean. I think I'm just about ready too after the life I lived. I think I do want to visit my old home in NCR, though, before that happens. He paused once more, considering everything the two had said since the start of the talk, and how little it all meant in the grand scheme of their lives built on atrocity. Neither aware or able to commit the only act needed for true peace and true acceptance of what they'd done. I honestly don't think I really care too much about battling NCR anymore. I just want to go home. The legate propped himself up from his dead state as the fire grew even more in his eyes. Even though the revived flame did little to change the grayness of his face, the legatus met the eyes of his creation, saying with that continued tone of defeat, "Me too, drifter." Lord Interfector finally stood from his place, mind still swarming with thoughts, but unparalyzed by their weight. He recentered his mind on the task at hand. Feeling the weight of his armor replace the weight of his soul's defeat, Lord Interfector stood looking down at the legate, who was recovering much more slowly. "I guess I'll see you in the Divide before we march on NCR proper. Shouldn't be more than a few months from now, right?" Graham looked back into the eyes of Lord Interfector, the words serving as another reminder of the fate he knew deep down was close. "I'm not sure I'll ever cross the Colorado." Lord Interfector grew a slight smile. If there was anything he ever saw himself an expert in, it was being good at heart in an undeniably bad nation, even if that goodness within still resulted in a bad sum characterization. Because of that, he took the legate's words and brushed them off as he adjusted his armor. "I'll see you there, Graham. Keep your head up." Just then he saw the flame in Graham's eyes glow even brighter before the elite concluded, "I might like to meet this secret friend of yours sometime when we reach the West." For the briefest moment, the fire in the legate's eyes died completely before returning once more, followed by a tragic grin. "He already knows you, knew you your whole life, and—" He stopped, finding some sort of hope in the elite's suggestion, but knowing what it would take in service to the bull for them to meet up in the West, he said, "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." At that, the elite saw the new hope behind the fire in his legate and friend's eyes, and grinned once more before saying, "I'll see you on the other side of the river, Graham." Lord Interfector departed his tent while Graham collected himself further. As the elite went to go survey and introduce himself to the commanders of the new centuries he was assigned, Alaron sat in his place stunned. Alaron had overheard the entire conversation from his spot on that bench next to the wall of his elite's tent. Upon learning that he could overhear the private conversation from that seat, his mind battled itself about whether or not he should listen at all, since the words were not for himself. He had heard so many things said by two of the Legion's greatest commanders that could have been called treason against Caesar or the Legion. Part of him felt he should report the two of them to someone. There was no other someone's higher than his elite in 400 miles, and nobody higher than Legate Graham other than Caesar himself. Legatus Graham and Lord Interfector were the words of Caesar, and the more he heard from the two men, the more he began to think for himself and form his own opinions about thoughts he'd never had. In the end, Alaron had no desire to report either man to anyone or anything. He had heard everything said and came to a resolution created by himself based on experience with the two men. Alaron continued to figure out all that he'd learned and consider the subsequent thoughts, trying to make sense of the ones he'd never had before that went something like this. Alaron had learned that the two men he met firsthand and respected most in his whole life had resigned themselves to a fate that neither of them wanted at some point in their lives for service to Caesar. Both the legatus and his commander and friend of 14 years clearly had regret for everything they've done for Caesar. Their conclusion said the monolithic and unifying force the Legion remains something worth serving till the end. And this was shown by their complete resignation to the Legion's speculated end for both men, despite internal misgivings about their roles under Caesar himself. As Alaron continued to grapple with his thoughts and understand the reality of what he overheard, he was so locked in his own head trying to better understand the two men he served with all his being that he didn't even notice how low the sun had gotten or take notice of the new arrivals in the camp. Centurion Montano led his century past the entry posts and stepped into the Interfector's camp limits. He took notice of the large force Legatus Graham had brought up on the separate task and ordered his legionaries where to begin setting up, briefly looking back the way he came to see the long line of crimson creeping closer and closer to the encampment. Turning back to the camp center, Montano looked for the Interfector or his legatus to check in with, but couldn't see either in the mass of red shuffling about the camp and all over the surrounding cliffs. When his eyes landed on the command tent atop a small hill, he instantly saw the legate emerge. As his staff began directing the force where to stand by, Montano's eyes drifted from the legatus to a centurion sitting on a bench beside the command domicile. Montano absently approached the legate for orders and arrival duties. His eyes were still trained on the centurion sitting on that bench. He speculated at first glance, but the closer he got to the legate, the more clearly he could detail the other centurion. When he was within 50 yards of the legion's second, Montano could clearly see that the centurion was Aleron, who hadn't even noticed his arrival. Aleron sat on that bench with a face that Montano had never seen before, seemingly locked in some deep contemplation. Centurion Montano shrugged the thoughts of his rival out of his head when he stepped before Legatus Graham, ready for new orders. Lord Interfector did as he was instructed and departed for the Divide by the end of that week in mid-October, taking his newly assigned cohort out to see his special task in the Mojave War was done. Being such a unique assignment that was taking the Interfector so far, Aleron was granted special permission from Legate Graham to carry out the last instruction from Lord Interfector of Phoenix. Aleron was ordered to take the Interfector's child named Abel and wife Amethyst to the care of his briefly mentioned friend from prior days called Marcus Dinero, an administrator in the Flagstaff Palatiae. Centurion Aleron carried out his order expertly, not less than 2 weeks after the elite's departure, and left the written instruction of Lord Interfector in the hands of Marcus Dinero, who would hold the family until further notice or a time of reunion could be arranged. Within those instructions contained a demand to leave the child and wife to his old friend in the Frumentarii named Dalton, should the worst happen. It wouldn't be until Aleron arrived back under the legate's authority, and 2 months of preparation passed, before word reached Arizona about how the worst did in fact happen. Aleron never heard from the elite after his departure from the camp in northwest Arizona, and never heard from the family again after leaving them in Flagstaff. Though his lack of word about the family was due to them not being part of his life after the drop-off. The lack of word from the murderer of Phoenix came with an unusual explanation not more than a week before the Battle of Hoover Dam. Nobody knew what happened at the Divide, and the Interfector's disappearance became wrapped up with the legend of the Divide in the Legion's camps. As stated above, something strange but catastrophic happened in the place Aleron's Primus of 14 years was sent not long before the Battle of Hoover Dam. Though the Interfector wasn't the reason, the supply line he was sent to cut was destroyed by some other means. One way or another, the Legion usually wins, even during this time, and their goal was accomplished when an entire region west of the Mojave Wasteland was rendered completely uninhabitable. Despite the vanishing of an entire Legion cohort, and despite half of Death Valley being consumed into an enormous cloud of dust, the NCR across the Mojave and Lower California was still scrambling to figure out what happened out there when Legatus Graham launched his attack. The fate of the Interfector hit Graham when members of the Frumentarii reported what they'd seen beyond the cloud of dust, but the fire of wrath in him had been reignited with an enemy in front. Even though both commanders had accepted their ends, Graham, despite his breakdown, was a man of untethered rage who remembered the Interfector's fate and how that man embraced what he was, seeing his end for the Legion's banner, despite the wars in his own mind. So, with Aleron and Montano under the command of their Legatus Imperialis, it was the early months of 2277 when both found themselves on the front lines of the first battle in Caesar's newest war, the Legion's final war. This was a war that would put new meaning behind the duelists' feud, when all they'd been through culminated in one massive shockwave created by the fall of a Goliath.